Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Words and Numbers brought to you by no one.
It is brought by no one.
We should be getting that corporate sponsorship we keep talking about. You know, the guitar makers, the cigar makers, the pipe tobacco people.
Well, at the moment, it's brought by the good people on Patreon.
That is correct. And thank you once again to all of you. But really, I'm looking for Coca-Cola to move in here behind us and give us that push to greatness that we require right now. As I think about that, because I always think about something different when you start talking, as I think about that, what's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Apple's recent announcement that it was going to start scanning people's iPhones looking for child pornography.
That's a pretty crappy business plan they've got there.
Yeah, it's certainly well-intentioned, but as we pointed out, fraught with problems beyond the obvious privacy issues, like Apple's search algorithms need to be near perfect to avoid flagging innocent pictures and so unleashing a nightmare on innocent users. The news is it took all of about 2 weeks for Apple to do an about-face. Last week, Apple announced it would pause testing the tool it was to use for spying on people's phones. It's now saying that if, not when, but if it does eventually launch the tool, it will include an opt-in feature.
If that's the case, it's kind of pointless, don't you think? What
think
pedophile
so.
will say, I know, I will opt into this program that Apple has?
Yeah, there's that, but then I'm reminded of all the videos I've run across of stupid criminals.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
I could imagine it's still going to grab people.
My God, this seems so very stupid.
Apple's fumble is a beautiful example of consumer regulation. People tend to think of markets as being either regulated or unregulated. In their minds, regulated markets have the guiding hand of government that keeps consumers safe, but unregulated markets are the Wild West where businesses can't wait to pollute, defraud, and kill their customers. The truth is, all markets are regulated. Regardless of whether government is involved, all markets are regulated by consumers. When you choose to purchase a product, you are allowing a business to continue. When you choose not to purchase a product, you are making it harder for the business to continue. And businesses are deathly afraid of consumer regulation, much more so than they are of government regulation. Apple's about-face is one example, but the examples are so numerous we tend not to notice them. For example, PETA has been campaigning to stop Fortnum & Mason, a luxury London department store, from selling foie gras. Celebrities also jumped into the fray, but Fortnum & Mason kept right on selling the fattened goose liver. Until last winter, Fortnum & Mason announced that out of concern for how the geese were treated, they would no longer sell foie gras. There's no doubt that PETA and the celebrities brought the public's attention to this issue. But what matters to a company is what its consumers want. And Fortnum & Mason's consumers had finally said enough. The company's annual sales growth, which had been in the double digits for much of the past decade, slowed to near zero. That's consumer regulation at work.
I got nothing good to say about foie gras. I mean, I don't understand why anybody would willingly put that into his mouth and swallow it.
I've actually had it. It's quite good.
So very disgusting, and you're very disgusting.
But examples like this go on and on. Cartier, the diamond people, pledged to stop buying conflict diamonds. SeaWorld, a couple of years ago, announced it would end all orca breeding programs because of customer concerns about orcas being kept in captivity. In the face of the largest ever student boycott, Fruit of the Loom, the underwear people, reopened a Honduran factory it had closed after workers had unionized.
I want to take us in a completely different direction, although the consumer is implicated here too. There is a group, maybe even a gaggle, of Democrats in Congress who want to implement a virgin plastics tax. Have you heard of this?
No, I don't know what virgin plastics is.
Virgin plastics would be plastic of first usage. So It comes out of the factory as a thing, and it was never anything else. You can't say it was recycled. This tax would not apply to recycled things. The virgin plastic tax, why, you ask, I would imagine, to save the oceans. Well, it is okay, but I want to predict right here, right now, that lots of things that people want and that they purchase will become more expensive as a result of this feel-good nonsense.
They will. Let me throw out another prediction, and I don't know the numbers on this, but I know that they need to be looked into, and that is it may actually be more costly. That is, it uses more resources to recycle plastic than to produce the virgin plastic.
We have this argument here at the house weekly.
So what this may end up doing, and I again emphasize may because I haven't looked at the numbers here, but what it may end up doing is exactly what happened with the ethanol thing. The government requires ethanol to be in gasoline. It actually ends up being worse for the environment.
Yeah, and I can give you this factoid. 9% of plastic waste is recycled in the United States.
Is it? Yeah.
You know, it's not a lot, and what that means is that almost all the plastics in our lives are virgin plastics, which means that almost every time we use plastic from here on out, we're going to get taxed, if this, of course, gets rifled through. But, you know, in a Biden White House and a Democratic Congress, I see no way that this doesn't go rifling right through.
Well, let me give you a third prediction, and that is, if this does go through and the government does start collecting a bunch of money, it's not going to be used to clean the oceans. It's going to be used for something else.
The obvious rejoinder is, well, sure, Ant, but because the plastic is more expensive, fewer people use it, and definitionally, the oceans will be saved. This is just that kind of thing that happens in the background. Nobody ever talks about it. And then they're appalled a year hence when they figure out, oh, good Lord, I pay 20% more on every single thing that involves plastic.
Right.
And I urge you to walk around your house, your home, your apartment, wherever you live, and take a look at just how many things are made out of plastic. They're all going to be more expensive as soon as this passes. That, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And you might have thought that taxing plastics would be foolish, but we're going to the land of post-COVID employment. There's this new thing. I don't know if you've seen it yet. It's called tattleware. Apparently, when you're working at home, there is this software that your firm can employ that takes a picture of you at your desk at your computer every number of minutes.
I have. Yes, I did see that.
Look, on the one hand, you and I would probably say it's sensible for an employer to look after the employees and make sure they're actually doing their work. Okay, yeah, I actually agree with that. However, can't you judge that from looking at the output without spying on people at their desks in their homes? And it seems like this is about 8 steps way too far. And thankfully, people are getting tired of it and they're quitting jobs of firms that do this sort of thing, which I guess right now they can do, right? It's really a seller's market for labor. But tattleware, right? And you can just see how this is going to stick around. And it's a strange, strange thing because if the government were doing this, we'd refer to it as Orwellian. And it would be Orwellian. But it's no less Orwellian when a private company does it. You can opt out. Yes, I get it. I also get that a private company can do whatever the hell it wants. But what I'm saying here is that no right-thinking corporation should ever want to do this.
I can't help but wonder how much of this sort of nonsense is middle-level managers desperately trying to make themselves relevant.
That's always a problem. You and I talk about this from time to time. It's pretty clear to both of us that efficiency in the workforce, right? Workplace output, these sorts of things, not what you would probably want in a perfect world, right? You would want people showing up to work, working 8 solid hours, being very productive, and then going home. And that's not at all the reality of the American workplace. The reality is that people show up, they have coffee and donuts for a while, they go to their respective cubicles or offices, they do 20 minutes worth of work, they have 3 absolutely meaningless meetings, then they go to lunch, and then they're back, and it's another meeting, and maybe an hour's worth of work, and then, okay, it's 3:30, no point in getting started on anything new. Right. Let's just coast to the finish line. Most people, as far as I can tell, do about 3 hours worth of work in a full-time 8-hour day.
That sounds about right.
I don't know anybody who would tell me that that's not right. And look, I'm talking about the averages here. I'm not talking about coal miners breaking their backs every minute of every day. You can see the difference, and I can see where the hate mail's coming. Nonetheless, right, the standard office job that people aspire to have for most of their young lives. Good Lord, we have March Madness every year, and people sit at their desks watching basketball games, and output never falls. So let's face it, output's about 3 hours a day. And I'm fine with that. I don't know that I would run my company like that, but, you know, you got no choice if you got no choice. And I don't think tattleware is the answer. but I will leave a link in the show notes for everybody to get their own perspective on this thorny matter.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible.
We're supposed to be talking about taxes today, and that's, generally speaking, one of the topics that we often get to that gets me all agitated.
Yeah, it's either gets you agitated or bores you.
Well, yeah, that's exactly correct, isn't it?
I share those sentiments.
And look, I got to say to a lot of people who are listening right now, taxation is not theft. It is a lot of other things, none of which we want.
Take a minute and expound on that.
There is a cost, and you know this, everybody knows this. There's a cost to living inside of any group. And notice, we don't create society. Society emerges. When society emerges, there's going to be more than a couple of things that need to be funded in order to have a pretty decent life. And many people say, I never consented to that, so I'm not paying for it. But that's not how consent works. You either consent to the whole thing, and this is true of every single philosopher that wanted to talk about the state of nature. If you say, I'm not willing to do this to pay, well, you got to get out. You don't consent to individual things when you're governed. You consent to the government itself. And if you've consented and there's a constitution and it clearly lists something that needs to be paid for, I don't know, like the United States Constitution does, well, you're going to have to pay it. Now, you have a right to a jury trial. It's in the Bill of Rights. Well, that just doesn't happen for nothing. That's not like a picnic that explodes in your backyard. That's actually a serious charge. You need a serious court. You need a public building to house the court. You need a public employee, a judge. You probably need a bunch of other support employees. And before you know it, this is a little pricey.
Well, now, people are going to come back, as they have to me when I've said similar words, and say something like, well, yeah, but you could have a private court system. There are examples of that.
You can get into arbitration right now,
right,
in many places. And power to you if it works. You don't want to have a private court hearing certain kinds of cases. We also have an army and a navy, and we can quibble about how big they should be, how powerful they should be. But the fact that every nation in the world since time immemorial has had some version of this probably indicates that you're not going to get rid of your version of this anytime soon, which means it's a collective benefit, so we all pay for it. The end. Just because you don't like what it was used for doesn't mean it was theft.
You can make theoretical arguments that we could privatize everything, but the fact of the matter is that's never been done before. And if it hasn't been done before, that tells me as an economist there's some reason. Now, that's not to say it won't happen in the future, but it hasn't happened so far. So if you want to talk about human beings as they exist right now, in the types of societies as they exist right now, you're going to have government. And I hate saying those words, but that's the case.
Aristotle, Thomas Jefferson, and I all commend you, Anthony, for coming to this understanding. It's the correct one. Now, there are times when taxation in certain forms is absolutely theft. And right now I'm thinking about how civil asset forfeiture works. Because I just saw another story last night about a guy driving down the road in a pickup, and the police took $87,000 of his dollars. Because they just couldn't imagine why he might have them in his truck as he drove down the road. There's a correct response to that, and it's none of your business. You go back to being a cop, and I'll go back to being a guy who drives a pickup truck. None of your business. But the police don't take this none of your business attitude all that often.
They don't appreciate that.
No, they do not. And I guess if I were a police officer, I might not appreciate it either. That's what it takes to get to taxation as theft.
I'd go a step further because you said, look, we come together as a society and we have this constitution that we have agreed to. And the fact of the matter is the federal government as it exists today has gone far, far beyond what's allowed in the Constitution. So to that extent, I'd be willing to point to that and say anything the federal government does that goes beyond the limits of the Constitution, the money that it taxes to pay for those things is theft.
Well, you might be okay with that, and you well know, at least if you pay attention to the lectures I give in public all the time, that if we were to stick to the spending scheme under the Constitution as it was construed, let's say 1800 or so, you're going to pay about 2% of GDP.
That's right.
That's about what the Constitution
Now,
cost.
you'll be paying a lot more at the state level.
Sure, but that's not what we're talking about, right? And we can go a little further because from 1800 until about 1928, you're still going to be paying that same 2.5%. It's only what happened from 28 forward, think progressives, that saw everything skyrocketing, including your taxes. We do charge you more now. It runs about 30%. The people alive and well at the time of the American founding would have absolutely no way to understand 30% taxation.
Oh, yeah. Well, they lost their minds over the whatever fraction of a percent it was, back in the 1700s.
It was the Stamp Act, and before that it was the Sugar Act. And yeah, they got all kinds of pissed off over it. The Sugar Act is my favorite because it was a tax reduction.
Yeah, right.
I say this all the time, and people look at me like cows in the field. I could hear their eyes moistening as they blink looking at me. But what had happened is that the Sugar Act of 1733 had become such a non-starter. Nobody paid any attention to it, that the customs guys just used to let sugar come in and out. They would take a little bribe, and that was great. The English in 1763 decided, well, what we should really do is get people to pay the sugar tax, and, well, how better than to lower it? So they lowered the sugar tax, at which point the colonists lost their minds, saying, this is unfair, it's a violation. So here's where you know that Americans have always been just a little shifty about paying taxes. I get it, and I'm okay with it, but let's not sloganize the entire thing. Every tax is not theft.
And this goes to the question that I think is maybe unanswerable, but it's the important question. What do we owe each other? And we could spend a couple of episodes just talking about that.
Well, look, Ed, I think you can answer that question, and I've asked enough people what their answer to that question is. And from where I sit, I have been in every single income quintile. From low to high, I have experienced the joys and defeats of each one of these categories. And trust me, the low ones suck real hard, and those high ones, they're pretty great until you got to think about taxes.
Right.
And there it is. So you start asking a basic question. You say, all right, throw away everything you know about federal taxes. I just say, okay, what percentage of what you make do you consider fair? And fair means that other people have a claim on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what taxes are. It's your money that's taken away from you to do something for someone else. I get the same answer every time. It's 20%. 20% is the correct answer. Everybody I talk to is willing to say, take 20% of what I'm making and then just leave me alone. They're not thrilled with the 20%, but it's better than that nonsense that they have to do now, filling out 100 forms to figure out what they finally owe. As a matter of fact, Aunt, 20% is more than most of them are paying.
And it's not just filling out the forms. It's every 4 years when the new guy comes in wondering, is this guy going to raise my taxes? Because there's no acknowledged upper limit.
No, there is not.
What we want to talk about today is something in economics we call tax incidence. It answers the question, who ultimately pays a tax? I'll give you an analogy here. You give your kid $10 to go to the movies. And the kid walks up to the ticket counter, hands over the $10, receives a ticket. Who paid for the ticket? And you got two things here. On the one hand, the kid handed over the $10, but on the other hand, the $10 came from you. So in one sense, the kid paid for it, but really it was your money. Ultimately, you paid for it. That distinction is the difference between the statutory burden of a tax, that is, who actually hands over the dollars, and the economic burden of the tax, who ultimately paid. What we care about as economists, what everybody should care about, is the economic burden. The statutory burden doesn't matter. Government can say it's collecting the tax from whoever, but what really matters is who pays it. And I'll give you an example here, and this is something that a lot of people are unaware of, and they're shocked when I tell them. By law, Social Security tax is split. It's 12.4% total. 6.2% comes out of the employee's paycheck. 6.2% the employer pays on behalf of the worker. And people look at that and say, well, that's fair. The worker pays half, the employer pays half. Except...
I have an objection.
What's your objection?
That I, as a worker, paid for that whole thing.
Well, that's the interesting thing. Statutorily, it's split that way because that's from whom the government actually takes the dollars. But who pays it?
Yeah, but I could have made that 6.2% if they didn't get it sucked away.
That's the question. If the employer didn't have to pay that 6.2%, would it have come to me in the form of higher wages? If so, then really the full 12.4% is coming from the worker.
This actually becomes a real deal when you're 30 years into your work life and you're looking at 6.2% of your salary not showing up because of your end, and then another 6.2 that you could very easily have negotiated for, right? Because if your employer is paying that, trust me, they were always good with giving you that amount of money.
Right. That's how much money they're willing to shell out to have somebody do the job.
And when you make a big salary the way you do 30 years into the workforce, 12.4% of that is a lot.
Now, as luck would have it, the Congressional Budget Office has produced some research along these lines. And I have to preface this by saying that the Social Security tax has not changed in many years, the tax rate. And because it hasn't changed in many years, there's not much data that we can look at here. But CBO has looked at Social Security tax in the U.S. and also in foreign countries and come to the estimate that the employee pays 62% of the 12.4%. So you got the employer's half, the employee's half. It's not half and half. It's 62% on the backs of the employee. But the employer probably pays much less than whatever that is left over, 38%. Why? Because the employer, he's got to come up with the money somewhere, likely raises prices. So really, when you look at that 12.4% Social Security tax, the bulk of it is being paid by the worker, and then another chunk of it is being paid by the customers that the worker serves. This idea of who actually pays the tax is the topic of tax incidence. And it turns out that tax incidence varies depending on various things that are going on in the market. For example, the more of a necessity the good is, the more that the consumer's got to have this good, the more of the tax gets passed on.
Think exactly right now, the remnants of the hurricane in New Orleans.
Right. Whatever taxes there are on lumber down there are going fully to the consumer. Now, the government can say it's taxing the business. Nope, the business is passing that right on to the consumer. Why? Because there's a tremendous need for these things. The business can do that. You and I have written about Pennsylvania's gas tax. Pennsylvania has the highest state gas tax in the country.
Which makes a lot of sense, Ant, because Pennsylvania has the finest roads in any state of the... Yeah, no, that's right. I can't even finish that lie. It's so ridiculous. They have among the worst roads I've ever seen in my life.
And we're at 60 cents a gallon, almost 60 cents a gallon. When the gas tax was raised the last time, several years ago, proponents, principally politicians, said, well, don't worry about this tax. It's going to be paid by the oil industry. What the data seem to indicate is about 70% of that tax got passed directly on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So politicians can say all they want about we're taxing the oil companies. They just pass that on in the form of higher prices. Ultimately, it's really the consumer who's paying. The politician gets to hide and claim that he hasn't taxed the consumer.
The government made probably, 5-6 times as much profit as the gas company.
As the oil company, right, yeah.
I mean, so the next time you want to tell me about the evil oil companies, tell me about the evil government agencies that tax you 6 times as much on the same gallon of oil.
Is what the oil company's taking in, right. I'll give you another example, and this one is even easier to understand. Think about a grocery store. The grocery store sells food, and this is, again, it's a necessity, something the consumer has to have. But there's an added twist here, which is the profit margins on retail grocers are razor thin, roughly 2% profit margin. Now, suppose the government comes along and imposes a tax on grocery stores. And it does this, it says in the law, the grocery store has to pay this tax. So the politicians can say, no, people, we're not taxing you, we're taxing the grocery stores. Okay. Mississippi, for example, they have a 7% sales tax on food. 7%. If Mississippi's government said, we're going to collect this 7% and we're going to collect it from the grocery store, well, do the math here. If you've got a 2% profit margin, where are you getting the money to pay 7% in sales tax? you'd have to pass on 5% of that 7% sales tax just to have zero profit. So clearly, the economic burden here, the tax incidence, is falling on the consumer. It doesn't matter what politicians say about who they're collecting the tax from. It turns out the government has no control over who ultimately pays the tax. Zero. It doesn't matter what the law says. The market is going to sort out who pays the tax. Let me give you another example that goes in the other direction. Imagine a retailer who sells diamond jewelry. The typical profit margin here is above 40%. I think it's like 42% on average. And consumers regard this diamond jewelry as a luxury. So we got these two things at play. On the one hand, there's a tremendous cushion that's 40% profit margin. On the other, we're talking about a good that consumers don't have to have. This is a luxury. If the government comes along and imposed a tax, not on the retailer, but on the consumer. So if the government said, as George Bush the First did years ago, this diamond jewelry, this is an expensive thing, we're going to impose a tax on it, and you consumers, you who buy diamond jewelry, you have to pay 10% of its value in taxes. What's the jewelry retailer going to do? He's going to drop the price of the diamond jewelry by 10%. To absorb that tax himself. So again, we have the government saying, well, we're taxing the consumers. It's not the consumer who ultimately pays in this example. It's the jeweler. And how do I know this is what would happen? Because that's what we saw happen. When Bush the First instituted his tax on the rich, he taxed
the luxury
diamond
tax.
Jewelry. Yeah, the luxury tax. He taxed yachts, things that rich people would buy. It was principally the businesses that went under as a result. But going back to Bush, this was an interesting case. And this was like in the 90s, I think. Prior to Bush's luxury tax, the U.S. was a net exporter of yachts. Because of the luxury tax, we became a net importer.
If you can't make a profit given the tax, you're going to stop building.
It decimated the yacht industry in this country. It also decimated the small aircraft industry in this country. Same thing. There was a tax on private airplanes.
Politicians look at these things as if there are never ramifications. And the ramifications are so simple to see that children could tell you what's going to happen next. It's really just a logic game at that point. And children have great logic. You tell them, look, if this gets more expensive, what's going to happen? And they'll all look at you and say, well, you'll get less of it.
Right. Yeah, imagine that.
It just doesn't take a genius to figure out. When my children were young, and I mean really young, like 3 to 6 or 7, I was shocked at how correct their intuitive economic worldview was.
Oh, I see this all the time. Yeah, with young children, they get it.
They generally had it right. Now, there are some things they couldn't fathom, but the things they could, they got right. And you start to realize that they get educated away from knowing, which is the greatest sin of all.
And it's not just economics. Their sense of justice tends to be pretty spot on.
I always tell people that if you want to learn about what justice is, stay as far away from philosophy professors as you can.
Right.
And go watch kids on a schoolyard playing a game, because those kids will know exactly what fair is.
Yeah.
The professor will always have a doubt. Every young person knows exactly what's fair and exactly what isn't. And it's so obvious that when there's a tough case, all of the young people come together and vote on it together, like a jury almost. And it's always overwhelmingly clear what the sentiment is. So no matter what you're looking for, you're going to find it. If you're looking for children knowing about justice, about economics, they're pretty good. It's just the adults that ruin it for them down the road.
And that's kind of heartening to think about, that there's something fundamentally true about these things, that we seem to be born with this knowledge. I could be generous here and say, well, the problem is that politicians are just stupid, but I don't think that's the case. I think it's the case that politicians are perfectly well aware that they have no control over who ultimately pays a tax, and they make use of this by saying all sorts of things like, elect me and I'll force those rich people over there to pay for your education, knowing full well that what actually is going to come down the pike at the end may be you paying for your education. You're just not aware that that's what's happening.
If you want to look at something expensive and how we're going to pay for it, that lands on the backs of the middle class every single time, because it has to.
Where it lands is on the future generations.
Well, them too.
We've reached a point here where politicians just won't raise taxes anymore. It's much easier just to borrow. And what does that mean? That means the future generations are going to have to pay.
Yeah, I don't know what I think about that assertion, right? Probably because at the age of 54, I took out a 30-year mortgage. Now, I think we should all probably recognize what's going to happen here. I don't think I'm going to get that one paid off. But where do the payments fall? Well, they fall on me now and on the family later. Human things are just never as simple as partisans want to admit.
And they certainly don't fit into 10-second sound bites.
The conclusion that we want to draw here with the taxes would be something like, what's fair? What percentage would everybody say, okay, that's pretty fair, and then pay that without any complaining? And 20% is almost always the answer. If that's the case, I can make things really fair because I've just dismantled the entire industry of putting your taxes together. Because if you want to pay a 20% flat tax, multiply your income times 0.2 and you're done.
And you put the politicians' feet to the fire because now they can't promise things that we can't afford. If someone wants to give me X, they're going to have to argue to somebody else that we got to take something away because all we get's 20%.
That's all the time we've got on Words and Numbers. Be sure to follow us on the Twitter. Join our Words and Numbers Backstage Facebook group where the conversation continues. If you would like to send me interesting things, drop me a line. I'll tell you what my address is. Just leave Ant right out of it. And please, for a week or so, send us no email. It really piles up and it's getting kind of bothersome.
Piles up. James gets like one email every 3 days.
I'm getting all these emails now that people are saying, where's Words and Numbers? Where is it now that James got this new job? These two things are wholly unrelated.
We should take a moment to say that Words and Numbers, how should I want to say this?
Oh, no. Allow me.
Go ahead.
Fee no longer wanted to support Words and Numbers.
Fee no longer supports Words and Numbers, so you can find us no longer on Fee's website, but go to wordsandnumbers.org, and you'll see our whole list of episodes, and we're on all the podcast players as usual. And send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
And whatever contribution you were getting ready to send to Fee, well, just send it to our Patreon. We'd be more than happy to take it.
That would be excellent. Patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
Yeah, go over there. That's about all we've got to say this week. And Ant, I'll say it to you as I always do. Just be nice to each other. For God's sake, it makes me so tired to see people yelling at each other all the time. Just make an experiment of it this 1 week. Till next week, be well and good.
See you next week, James.